20,000 dead Americans. That's not my number. That's the optimistic estimate from analysts studying what a full ground invasion of Iran would actually cost. Before we go any further, I want to be completely clear about something important. As of right now, no U.S. ground invasion of Iran has happened. None has even been announced. But the deeper you look into what one would actually require, the worse this scenario genuinely gets. And I think you deserve to understand exactly why, with real numbers and real historical parallels, not just speculation. Here's where we need to start, because precision matters enormously on a story this serious. According to the Iran War Live Tracker, which sources directly from CENTCOM releases, the IDF, the Associated Press, Reuters, and Al Jazeera, as of July 24th, day 147 of this conflict, across 13 consecutive nights of strikes, the American target set has remained missile systems, air defenses, coastal radar, naval capabilities, refineries, and ports. Not territory. That tracker is explicit that no ground invasion has occurred and none has been announced. Let's hold on to that fact clearly, because it's going to matter throughout this entire breakdown. Everything we're about to discuss is about planning, analysis, and genuine risk, not something that's already happening on the ground inside Iran right now. Here's the detail that changed the conversation, though. According to that same tracking, on July 14th, the New York Times reported that the president declined to rule out an invasion. Not confirmed, not denied either. Left open, deliberately, by the one person whose decision would actually matter. Let's bring in reporting from Foreign Policy, because I think their sourcing here is genuinely important. According to their coverage, as the war has escalated, there are growing concerns that a ground operation could be on the horizon as relentless U.S. airstrikes fail to break Tehran's resolve. That's a direct acknowledgement that months of sustained bombing haven't yet achieved what American strategy was presumably designed to accomplish. Here's something worth sitting with directly, from a member of Congress specifically. According to that Foreign Policy reporting, Representative Ted Lieu said, quote, "I think he's shielded from bad news." So I certainly think that, in his head, he thinks a ground invasion is a plausible option. Shielded from bad news. That's a member of Congress specifically raising concern about whether the information reaching the president accurately reflects the actual risk involved in this exact decision. Let's think through why a concern like that, coming from a sitting member of Congress rather than an anonymous commentator, deserves real attention. Representative Lieu isn't simply speculating about the president's general temperament. He's raising a specific structural concern about the information pipeline feeding into a decision. This consequential, whether the people responsible for briefing the commander-in-chief are presenting the full, unfiltered range of expert casualty estimates and historical parallels, or whether that information gets softened or selectively filtered before it reaches the desk where the actual decision gets made. Here's why that concern matters so much regardless of which political party happens to hold power at any given moment. Every major military decision throughout history has depended heavily on the quality and honesty of the intelligence and analysis reaching the ultimate decision maker. A leader operating with an inaccurately optimistic picture of a potential conflict's costs is considerably more likely to view a catastrophic option as more plausible or more manageable than the actual underlying analysis would support. That's precisely the dynamic Lieu appears to be describing. Not necessarily a specific factual claim about hidden information, but a broader concern about whether the full weight of expert casualty projections, like the ones we're about to walk through, is actually landing with the force it deserves. Let's get into what military experts themselves are actually saying, because I think this is where the story gets genuinely more reassuring, at least for now. According to that same Foreign Policy reporting, former U.S. military officials and experts said the United States does not appear to be moving toward a major ground operation in Iran, which would require far more troops than the roughly 50,000 currently deployed in the region. 50,000 troops currently in the region, not remotely enough for what a full invasion would actually demand. That gap alone tells you something important about how far this specific escalation would have to travel before it became a physical reality rather than just a rhetorical possibility. Let's think through what actually closing that gap from 50,000 troops to whatever a full invasion would genuinely require would look like in practice. Mounting a full-scale ground invasion of a country the size and terrain complexity of Iran would require not just combat troops themselves, but the entire supporting infrastructure behind them, logistics units to keep fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies flowing continuously, engineering units to build and maintain forward operating bases, air support coordinated closely with ground movements, and enough total force to hold and secure territory once it's been taken, rather than simply passing through it. That kind of comprehensive troop requirement is exactly why analysts point to figures in the range of 100,000 or more, a number considerably beyond simply doubling the current regional deployment. Here's why assembling that scale of force wouldn't happen quietly or quickly, even if a decision were made today to pursue it. Moving that many additional troops, along with their equipment, vehicles, and supporting logistics, into the region would require weeks or months of visible transport and staging using ships, aircraft, and pre-positioned equipment stockpiles that would be difficult to conceal from the kind of open-source satellite tracking we've discussed in earlier breakdowns of this war. That visibility is actually one of the more reassuring aspects of this entire situation right now. A genuine full-scale invasion buildup wouldn't be a secret. It would be observable, tracked, and reported well before actual ground operations could realistically begin. Here's a direct quote I think deserves real weight from someone who's actually run this exact theater of operations. According to that same reporting, retired Army General Joseph Votel, who oversaw U.S. military operations in the Middle East from 2016 to 2019 as head of Central Command, said, quote, "I don't think we're looking to put troops in downtown Tehran." He also noted the White House doesn't appear to be considering a ground operation targeting nuclear sites specifically. A former CENTCOM commander on the record explicitly ruling out the most extreme version of this scenario. That's genuinely significant, and I don't want to bury it under hype. Let's talk about what a more limited version of this might actually look like, because that same reporting does describe something considerably more plausible. According to foreign policy, it's possible there will be ground forces involved in more limited operations, such as moving to seize important islands, specifically naming Karg Island, or special operations raids on military sites. Karg Island. Let's understand why that specific location matters so much. It's one of Iran's most critical oil export terminals, and seizing it would represent an entirely different scale of operation than a full territorial invasion. A targeted, limited action aimed at a single high-value economic choke point rather than an attempt to occupy the country. Let's think through why a Karg Island operation specifically would represent such a fundamentally different category of risk compared to a full invasion. Seizing and holding a single island, even a strategically vital one, requires a fraction of the troops, logistics, and sustained commitment that occupying broad stretches of mainland Iranian territory would demand. It's a mission with a clear, bounded objective, control of a specific export terminal, rather than an open-ended commitment to securing and administering territory against an ongoing insurgency or conventional resistance. Here's why that distinction matters so much for the casualty math we discussed earlier. The 20,000 fatality estimate we walked through applies specifically to a full 100,000 troop invasion scenario, not a limited island seizure. A targeted operation against Karg Island would carry real risk and real potential for casualties, but on an entirely different order of magnitude than the mass mobilization scenario analysts have modeled for a full ground war. That's exactly why understanding the difference between these two categories, limited seizure versus full invasion, matters so much for accurately gauging how seriously to take any specific headline you encounter about ground operations going forward. I also want to note something about why an island specifically, rather than a mainland target, might appeal as a more contained option if commanders did decide some form of ground action was necessary. Islands offer more clearly defined, more easily secured boundaries than an open land border, considerably simplifying the logistics of holding territory once it's actually been taken, compared to securing a stretch of mainland surrounded by hostile forces on every side. If a breakdown like this one that separates confirmed military planning from worst-case speculation, using named sources and direct quotes, is useful to you, take a second right now and hit like on this video. It genuinely helps put this kind of careful, properly verified coverage in front of more people trying to understand a threat this serious without falling for exaggerated claims in either direction. Let's get into the actual cost estimates, because this is where the story becomes genuinely alarming, even accounting for every caveat we've just walked through. According to reporting from WANA News, some American analysts believe that even if a full mobilization of 100,000 troops were launched for an invasion of Iran, the United States would, in the most optimistic scenario, suffer 20,000 fatalities. 20,000 in the most optimistic scenario. Not the worst case. The best case, analysts are willing to project. Here's something that should genuinely concern you about how differently the two sides are actually calculating this exact same scenario. According to that same WANA news reporting, Iranians estimate the number of American casualties would be far higher than that American analyst figure. Two different sides, looking at the exact same hypothetical invasion, and one side's own estimate is already dramatically higher than the other's best-case projection. Let's talk about why there's no guarantee of victory even at that enormous cost. According to that same reporting, there's no guarantee that even a mobilized American military would achieve victory in this specific scenario. I want you to sit with that phrase directly. Not a guarantee of a quick win, not a guarantee of victory at all, regardless of troop numbers committed. Here's the historical parallel that I think explains exactly why this scenario carries so much genuine uncertainty. According to reporting from Forbes, citing regional analyst Azizi, Iran has bitter memories of 6 years of unsuccessful attempts at capturing the city of Basra during the Iran-Iraq War. That's a direct reference to one of the bloodiest, most grinding ground conflicts of the late 20th century, a war that dragged on for 8 years total, and produced casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. 6 years, trying and failing to take a single city. That's the kind of grinding attritional warfare history this specific region has actually produced, when two determined militaries commit to a sustained ground campaign rather than a quick, decisive strike. Let's understand why that specific historical memory continues shaping Iranian strategic thinking even decades later. The Iran-Iraq War, running from 1980 to 1988, produced casualty estimates ranging from several 100,000 up to over 1 million dead across both countries, depending on which historical assessment you consult, making it one of the longest and bloodiest conventional wars of the entire 20th century. Iran's repeated, ultimately unsuccessful attempts to capture Basra specifically involved massive human wave assaults that produced catastrophic losses without ever achieving the city's capture. A defining, traumatic memory that continues to shape how Iran's own military and political leadership thinks about the costs of sustained ground combat. Here's why the history cuts in two directions simultaneously, both relevant to everything we've discussed today. On one hand, it explains why Iran's own leadership would be genuinely reluctant to invite a scenario, an actual ground war, that echoes one of the most costly and ultimately fruitless periods in its own modern history. On the other hand, it also explains why Iran might calculate that grinding attritional resistance rather than a quick capitulation represents its most viable strategic option if a ground invasion actually happened, drawing directly on institutional memory of how a technologically inferior force can still inflict devastating, prolonged casualties on a better equipped opponent under the right terrain and circumstances. I think this historical parallel is exactly why so many of the estimates we've discussed today, from American analysts and Iranian officials alike, converge on the same basic conclusion, that any full ground invasion would likely become a prolonged, extraordinarily costly affair rather than the kind of swift, decisive operation that toppled Iraq's government back in 2003. Iran's terrain, its decades of asymmetric warfare doctrine, and its own bitter institutional memory of exactly this kind of grinding conflict all point toward the same sobering conclusion. Let's pause here for a genuine question I want you to think through with me. If American analysts already estimate 20,000 fatalities in their optimistic scenario, and Iranian estimates run considerably higher than that, does any strategic objective in this conflict, degrading Iran's nuclear ambitions, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, forcing a diplomatic resolution, actually justify that scale of human cost? Drop your honest take in the comments, because I think that's the single most important question hanging over this entire scenario, more important than any specific tactical detail. I'll add one final layer to that question before we move on, because I don't think it has a clean answer, and I'd rather be honest about that than pretend otherwise. Every strategic objective in this war, however important it might genuinely be, has to be weighed against the very real possibility that pursuing it through a full ground invasion could cost tens of thousands of American lives, an even larger number of Iranian lives, and still might not guarantee the outcome either side is actually hoping to achieve. That's an extraordinarily difficult calculation for any government to make, honestly, and I think it's exactly the kind of decision that deserves the full, unfiltered weight of expert analysis, not a version softened by wishful thinking or shielded from the bleakest, most sobering estimates available. Let's talk about what Iran itself has been saying about this exact possibility, because their own rhetoric adds a genuinely important layer to this story. According to reporting from Fox News, published July 19th, Sayed Mohammad Marandi, an Iranian-American academic identified in that reporting as a regime mouthpiece, claimed Tehran has spent decades preparing for, and actually welcoming, a U.S. ground invasion. Welcoming an invasion. That's a deliberately provocative claim, and I want to be clear about exactly who's making it. Marandi is not a neutral analyst. He's specifically described in that reporting as a regime mouthpiece, meaning his statements should be understood as deliberate messaging on Iran's behalf, not independent assessment. Here's what he claimed specifically, according to that same reporting. That Iran has been accumulating missiles and drones for decades, and is continuing to do so even now, while decentralizing and burying its arsenal deep underground, specifically to withstand sustained American air campaigns. He also claimed Iran had just introduced what he called a new missile to the war. I want to flag something important here. These are claims from a single, clearly partisan source, not independently verified military assessments. That doesn't mean they're necessarily false. Iran's underground weapons storage has been documented and struck repeatedly throughout this conflict, as we've discussed in earlier breakdowns. But the specific framing, that Iran actively welcomes an invasion, deserves to be understood as psychological messaging aimed at deterrence, not a neutral description of Iran's actual military preference. Let's think through the actual strategic purpose behind a claim like welcoming an invasion, because I think understanding the intended effect matters more than debating whether it's literally, sincerely true. A statement like this serves a clear psychological function, regardless of Iran's actual internal preference, suggesting to any potential American decision-maker that ground forces would be walking directly into a trap Iran has spent decades preparing, rather than facing a weakened, reluctant adversary. That kind of messaging is specifically designed to raise the perceived cost of the invasion option in the mind of anyone considering it, functioning as a deterrent independent of whether Iran's actual leadership would genuinely prefer that outcome if it truly came to pass. Here's why I think it's important to hold this messaging up against everything else we've discussed, rather than let it stand entirely on its own. If Iran genuinely welcomed a ground invasion as a strategic opportunity, that would actually run somewhat counter to the broader pattern we've documented throughout this war. Underground weapons, storage specifically built to survive sustained bombing rather than invite direct ground confrontation, and a decades-long doctrine built around asymmetric, irregular warfare, specifically because Iran's own leadership has long recognized it cannot match a conventional American ground force directly. Public bravado, declaring a welcome for the very scenario your entire military doctrine has been built to avoid, is a fairly common wartime messaging tactic. And I think it's worth reading this specific claim through that lens, rather than taking it as a literal, sincere strategic preference. I also want to note that this kind of psychological messaging runs in both directions throughout this conflict, not just from Iran's side. Confident American statements about degraded Iranian capability and skeptical Iranian claims about welcoming an invasion they've spent decades preparing to resist both serve the same basic function, shaping perception and expectations on the other side, regardless of how closely either statement actually reflects the full, honest internal assessment either government has made privately. Let's talk about Iran's own threatened ground response, because this adds another layer of complexity worth understanding fully. According to that Forbes reporting, Iranian officials have repeatedly warned that Tehran could mount a ground offensive targeting U.S. bases in the region if American troops move to seize Iranian islands or territory, even suggesting the possibility of capturing American soldiers. Here's a direct quote from that same reporting, from a member of Iran's own parliament. According to Forbes, Ahmad Bakhshayesh Ardestani, a member of the Iranian parliament's National Security Committee, declared in mid-July, quote, "If the United States puts boots on the ground in Iran, we may also launch ground attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain." A former Iranian foreign minister, Manouchehr Mottaki, also a parliament member, reportedly went even further in his own threats. And let's talk about how seriously outside analysts actually take these specific Iranian threats, because I think this is exactly the kind of claim that needs independent scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. According to that same Forbes reporting, analysts are highly skeptical of Iran's ability to execute large-scale conventional ground operations at all, citing Iran's doctrine built around irregular warfare, its limited conventional projection capabilities, and the strong American and coalition presence already established throughout the region. That same reporting states plainly that any significant Iranian troop movement would be extremely vulnerable, and concludes that nothing like these hawkish Iranian parliamentary threats is actually likely to happen. Here's why that skepticism matters so much for understanding the full picture. We've just walked through American analysts questioning whether a U.S. ground invasion of Iran is worth the catastrophic potential cost. We're now looking at outside analysts describing Iran's own threatened ground counteroffensive as essentially inconceivable given its actual military capabilities. Both sides are making ground-based threats that serious independent analysis suggests neither side may actually be capable of executing at the scale being publicly claimed. Let's think through what this mutual skepticism actually tells us about the current state of this entire conflict. If credible outside analysts doubt both the American appetite for a full invasion and Iran's actual capability to execute the large-scale ground counteroffensive its own parliamentarians have threatened, that suggests both sides may currently be relying more heavily on deterrent rhetoric than on genuine, immediate operational planning for the most extreme ground scenarios being publicly discussed. That's a meaningfully different situation than one where both sides are actively, concretely preparing for exactly the ground war their public statements describe. Here's why I think that distinction offers a genuine, if cautious, note of reassurance amid everything else we've covered today. Rhetoric serves real strategic purposes in an active conflict, shaping perception, testing resolve, and establishing deterrent thresholds, without necessarily reflecting an actual, near-term operational plan. The gap between what both sides are publicly threatening and what independent military analysts assess as actually feasible right now is worth remembering every time a new, dramatic ground war headline circulates throughout the remainder of this conflict. I don't want to overstate that reassurance, though, because rhetoric can sometimes harden into actual policy. especially as a war grinds on and existing strategies fail to produce a decisive resolution. The fact that a full invasion isn't currently being actively planned, according to the sources we've walked through today, doesn't mean that calculation couldn't shift if the current bombing campaign continues failing to achieve its stated objectives over the following weeks or months. If breakdowns like this help you separate genuine military planning from provocative rhetoric on either side, subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because this exact question, whether ground escalation becomes reality or stays confined to threats and worst-case analysis, is likely to remain one of the most consequential open questions in this entire war. Let's talk about the broader historical arc of how we even got to this point, because I think it matters for understanding just how far this specific war has already traveled. According to Britannica's documented account of this conflict, Operation Epic Fury, the joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign, began on February 28, 2026, with its opening strikes specifically including the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. That same account documents a limited ground invasion beginning March 17th, amid reports at the time that a broader ground offensive was considered likely, alongside Israeli forces separately occupying territory in southern Lebanon. Here's something worth understanding from that same historical record. In the weeks following those opening strikes, the United States undertook its largest military buildup in the Middle East since its 2003 invasion of Iraq. That's a genuinely significant historical comparison, tying this conflict's early buildup directly to the scale of one of the most consequential American ground wars in modern history. Let's think through why that specific comparison to the 2003 Iraq invasion carries so much weight for anyone trying to gauge how this current situation might unfold. The 2003 invasion of Iraq began with a similarly massive regional military buildup, followed by a rapid, initially successful conventional invasion that toppled the existing government within weeks. What followed that initial success, however, was nearly a decade of grinding insurgency, sectarian violence, and continued American casualties that dramatically exceeded the relatively low toll of the initial invasion itself. That history offers a genuinely important lesson. The difficulty of a ground campaign against a determined adversary often lies less in the initial invasion itself and more in what follows afterward, securing, administering, and stabilizing territory against an opponent that shifts toward irregular, asymmetric resistance once conventional defense becomes untenable. Here's why that lesson applies with particular force to a potential invasion of Iran specifically. We've already discussed throughout this entire breakdown that Iran's military doctrine is built specifically around irregular asymmetric warfare, precisely because its leadership has long understood it cannot match a conventional American force directly. That means any American ground force that did succeed in an initial conventional phase would very likely face exactly the kind of prolonged grinding insurgency that made the aftermath of the Iraq invasion so much costlier than its initial combat operations, a pattern Iran's own leadership has had 2 decades to study closely, sitting right next door to exactly where it played out. Let's connect that history to where things stand today. A memorandum of understanding was reached in June, specifically intended to end this war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. According to that same Britannica documentation, despite that agreement, Iran continued threatening and attacking ships passing through the strait, hoping to coerce international shipping into following Iranian-controlled routes and protocols. That continued pressure on the strait is precisely what's kept this conflict escalating week after week, well past the point diplomacy was originally supposed to have resolved it. Let's think through why a limited ground invasion back in March didn't resolve this conflict, and why that history matters for evaluating today's much larger, much more consequential scenario. If a smaller ground action back in March, alongside months of sustained aerial bombardment since, still hasn't produced the diplomatic resolution this entire campaign was presumably designed to achieve, that raises a genuinely difficult question about what a considerably larger, considerably costlier full invasion would actually accomplish that everything already attempted hasn't. Here's the honest, complete picture worth sitting with as we bring this together. No full ground invasion has happened, and current expert analysis suggests American military leadership isn't actually pushing for one at the scale that would be required. But the option hasn't been ruled out by the one person whose decision matters most. A limited operation targeting a specific asset like Karg Island remains genuinely plausible according to former officials. And the cost estimates for anything beyond that limited scope run into tens of thousands of American casualties in even the most optimistic projection available. Let's close by walking through exactly where every single piece of this account came from, because that transparency is the entire foundation of why this kind of coverage deserves your trust. The current status confirming no ground invasion has occurred came from the Iran War Live Tracker, sourcing directly from CENTCOM, the IDF, and major wire services. Trump's refusal to rule out an invasion, the broader concerns about a coming ground operation, Representative Liu's direct quote, and General Votel's on-record statements all came from foreign policy's detailed reporting. The specific casualty estimates, including the 20,000 fatality optimistic projection and Iran's own higher estimate, came from WANA News. The historical parallel to Iran's failed attempts at capturing Basra came from Forbes, citing analyst Azizi. Morandi's regime messaging about welcoming an invasion came from Fox News, with that outlet's own explicit identification of him as a regime mouthpiece. The Iranian parliamentary threats against Kuwait and Bahrain, along with independent analysts' skepticism of Iran's actual capability to execute them, also came from Forbes. And the broader historical arc of this entire war came from Britannica's documented account. Every single one of those threads is attributed to a specific named source, and anywhere a claim came from an openly partisan voice, like Morandi's regime messaging, I told you that plainly, rather than presenting it as neutral fact. One last thing before you go. If separating confirmed military reality from worst-case speculation and partisan rhetoric on both sides actually helped you understand this specific threat more clearly, share this with someone following this war who might have seen a headline about invasion and assumed it had already begun. No invasion has happened. None has been announced. But a sitting president has refused to rule it out. A former CENTCOM commander has specifically ruled out the most extreme version while leaving a limited island seizure genuinely on the table. And the analysts willing to run the numbers on anything larger arrive at a casualty estimate in the tens of thousands, even in their most optimistic scenario. That's the real, complete picture behind a question this serious, verified everywhere the evidence actually supports it, and clearly labeled as speculation everywhere it doesn't. Stay with reliable, properly sourced reporting as this continues to develop, and I'll be back the moment there's something real and properly confirmed worth bringing you. I want to leave you with the same closing standard I try to apply to every single one of these breakdowns. A headline claiming a ground invasion is worse than we thought could easily be built entirely on fear, implying an invasion is imminent or already underway, when the actual, verified reality is considerably more layered. No invasion has happened. Serious military voices are actively counseling against the most extreme version of this scenario, and the specific numbers, when you actually look them up, rather than just imagining them, are worse than most casual coverage of this conflict has probably conveyed. That's not a contradiction. It's exactly the kind of nuanced, uncomfortable truth a story this consequential actually deserves, worse in the numbers, but not yet in the reality on the ground, and worth watching closely precisely because that gap between rhetoric and action could close faster than anyone currently expects.